Okay, well, hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me at your meeting. My presentation, Earls and Rebels of Southeast England, pertains to my dad's colonial English lines and the 2017 journey I took to track them down.
Can I get the film?
It stars my 10th great grandparents, Governor John Haynes of Connecticut Colony, his second wife, Mabel Harlakenden, and Governor Thomas Dudley of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and their English ancestors, or at least some of them. So about those three, John Haynes in 1633 came to America with Reverend Thomas Hooker. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. Colony. Haynes was a wealthy widower by then, with 6 children still living in England. In 1636, Mabel arrived. She was 20 years younger, married Haynes, and they stayed at that point in the house of Thomas Dudley, the other English Puritan governor of Massachusetts. Actually, Haynes served one term in Massachusetts also before, in late 1636, he and his wife joined Hooker and established Connecticut Colony, where Haynes was governor for 8 terms, non-consecutive terms, because at that time in New England, you weren't allowed to serve other than 1 term at a time. So it was over an approximate 17-year history that he was on and off governor of Connecticut, and he was quite popular. Dudley was kind of an irascible sort of fellow. They have a lot of history in America, but my purpose here is to talk about their ancestors in England, so we'll kind of move on to that. Before that, I just want to say, because so often I have heard it at our British interest groups and other settings that people don't necessarily feel connected to these folks, and it actually, if you live almost anywhere in the world, it's kind of hard to not be connected to British people because they went everywhere. In this case, Dudley is believed by historians to have at least 2 million descendants just in America. John Haynes, with his second wife, 1 to 2 million, somewhere in that range, so not quite as many. But with his first wife, you had millions in the UK and around the world. You have to think about all the soldiers he probably, had descendants thereof. And then the ancestors those 3 had before 1600s, no doubt, produced millions and millions of descendants around the world. And you think of all the countries that Britain colonized and so forth and so on. So my point being, some of this history could easily be yours too, and that of many people. But for tonight's purpose, Dudley had a grandson, Timothy I, and Haynes had a granddaughter, Mehitable. They met, married, and created a line to my grandmother. And here's how that looks. So here are the 2 governors, and with Mabel, and they had daughters each, who married and produced Timothy and Mehitable, who then had a son named Timothy II, and the lines are identical until my grandmother. So what did I know about this line before I started my research? Based on things, papers and photos and all kinds of other things my aunt had done and my dad had done and so forth before that. I knew up to Dorothy. I didn't know Thomas's name, but I sort of generally knew of him. And from here on down, I had a lot of information and photos and so forth. So yeah, it was really connecting this guy to these folks. And this slide shows the will that did that. And then I visited his grave in the same town where they were all born. And so you get the general idea from the American colony side of things. The sources I used are here, and so as far as, when the internet hit, I created a family tree. I started looking at these sites, and of course I found some things at GFO Library, and then these were the sources I used in the United Kingdom. And some were on site when I arrived, and then some were just invaluable connections like this one. The webmaster there, you'll see him later. And then these two sources I can't recommend highly enough when you're researching online. You'd be amazed how many ancestors you might have, if you have British ancestors, who were in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords as well, quite possibly. This book was published, just about 10 years before I was contemplating my trip, and just was really invaluable for the Essex area for me. And then I just want to say I am so lucky to have ancestors in Connecticut Colony, because boy, did they keep good records compared to much of the rest of the colonies. And there were a lot of people that kept those in good state as time passed. So I feel grateful for that. And I have other ancestors from elsewhere, so I know the difference. So I'm also grateful for this second cousin. Through my research, this resource Stokes Records kept popping up, but it didn't have a citation. It didn't explain that this was a person. And I went several years, actually more than several years, trying to figure out what this was. Eventually, online, I did find out the source, and also there was mention of that name in some papers I found of my dad's. So he was a second cousin. He compiled this private family genealogy, 2 huge volumes that were called Stokes Records. This is the span of time that he compiled them in, and his grandfather had started some of that as well. Then he made a lot of trips to England, but this was a specific to genealogy trip where he brought back data, documents, even portraits regarding our ancestors. And some of that made its way into databases. While he was there in Essex, he befriended someone I'll call Captain Geoffrey, who was a key descendant of Mabel Harlequinden's family. And Anson became such good friends with them that he actually became godfather to one of his sons. 125 years later, well, you're going to see that. In 2019, when I came back from this trip, I found a copy. I was so lucky. It was like the only one left of the originals in the U.S. And looking through it, I was just floored that I had really been following in his footsteps. For example, Thomas Dudley was baptized at this church, and here's Anson's photo in 1892, and then my photo 125 years later in 2017. We both were standing in the same place. This is about as obscure as a place you could imagine visiting, and no tourists go here, so it's not like Windsor Castle or something where you can say everyone took a photo from there. So there are a lot of examples like this that make me feel so connected to this fellow that I seem to follow in the footsteps of and continue to learn from. And so here is his books, and they're huge, and you can see I've tagged a lot of it. And one of the great surprises inside it was this portrait of my 4th great grandfather, Thomas Woodbridge Phelps of the War of 1812. I'd never seen his image before, and he had, some interesting other details about this part of the family. So anyway, Anson spent a fortune on genealogy, left no stone unturned, visited every place that held records. He went all over Britain. He photographed things. He was a pretty remarkable family genealogist. How really am I related to him? So, and you'll see why this is important in a minute. So here is that same Thomas Woodbridge Phelps, 4th great grandfather. He had a younger brother, 10 years younger than himself, named Anson, who the author of the Stokes Records was named for, and this is his grandson. And all of these folks were Connecticut born, and my great grandfather was the first to be born outside Connecticut. Now, inside the book are many of these. They're all kinds of charts. This is called a fan chart. So the entire left side are the ancestors that I share with Anson. So here's Anson Green Phelps, the younger Anson's grandfather and younger brother of my ancestor. And then these from here on are our direct ancestors together, going up to the progenitors from England. Now I'm going to turn it on its side, and you can see here all the Connecticut ancestors and all the English folks. And then tonight, 674, we're talking about Thomas Dudley, and 678, John Haynes and his wife Mabel. Now this is a 121-year-old book, and the work he did is pretty flawless, and he had no internet, and it's really quite remarkable. And whoever he had handwrite this out, I applaud them. So this set up me for this, all the research I had done for 10 years, some of which no doubt had been filtered from Anson's work. I wound up concluding my plan this way with these 6 sites in Essex. And I just want to say my son is here tonight, and the trip actually started out in London and over in Berkshire and Salisbury and so forth, but he was with me for that. But this was the last week of a 7-week trip, and I was certain that I had seen so many amazing and wonderful things, including with my son, that I couldn't believe it could get more amazing than that. Well, each thing was amazing. So anyway, John Haynes' estate is just southwest of Colchester, and that's the old Roman capital of Britannia. Mabel's family estate was here at Earl's Colne, and that's a village named for the Earls of Oxford, and that was their sort of second home area. And then in just over the border in Hertfordshire, Sawbridgeworth is where her maternal line has some memorials. And then Thomas Dudley sites for the Earls of Oxford, who are his ancestors, we'll be talking about tonight. Castle Hettingham, their home estate, which is their primary estate. Bures, Suffolk, just over the Essex border. And then way over here in western Essex, Hatfield, Broad Oak, where one last Earl of Oxford has his tomb. So on we go, and destination 1, Copford Hall. So how did I know John Haynes had this estate at Copford? Well, it was helpful that it says so on his gravestone. However, this was done in actually the 1800s, because his original was, it sort of sunk in the ground or was not found in Hartford. But I went ahead and did more research, and these are just 2 of the sources. Morant's History of Essex had this information that he'd purchased it before 1624, and that also in British History Online, which has multiple sources, he purchased it by 1626. This source was helpful in explaining. Sorry, I'm just going to pause here. I'm needing to shift into full screen, and I'm not sure why it's not doing that. Hang on just a sec. Let's see if I can do that. Is it something that's not happening maybe on your end, or let's see.
Well, we're seeing the next slide besides the main slide.
Okay, so okay, hang on. Let's see.
We're seeing presenter view.
Oh, I am so sorry, because that's only supposed to show to me. It's weird on Zoom, it only shows to me. Oh dear. I can see your screen, so.
I think it might be down at the bottom. Yeah.
Well, that just blackens the slideshow for me. What does that do on your end?
Go full screen.
I blackened it for us too.
Yeah.
Can you drag it?
Well, the problem is if I go to that, I can't see my notes.
Oh.
But I can wing it.
Full screen now.
Yeah, that's because I can't see my notes, but you know, I could wing it because I think it's important for you guys to see it. If you don't mind, I'll have to wing it.
There, you got it.
Yeah, I just can't read my notes. That's the problem. But we'll just wing it. Okay, so hang on just a sec. So you'll notice this is a portrait that for many years was believed to be the portrait of John Haynes based on a sketch that was among his belongings, but now the Connecticut Museum believes that it's actually his son's. And his son had an interesting life. Both his sons were sort of interesting. Robert was a royalist and so was heir to Copford Hall, but just briefly because he died not just 3 years after he inherited. And then his younger brother Hezekiah went the opposite way politically and became one of Oliver Cromwell's major generals during the English Civil War. And he was imprisoned in the Tower of London for that, just for a couple of years though, and then he was released and spent about 30 years living at Copford Hall. So there is, you know, a fair long history of the family at the estate, including after his time. The portrait I was just about to say is probably of Hezekiah. Now they think because he's in armor, and John Haynes is not known to have had any role in the English militia, or excuse me, the colonial militia in New England, or a military role when he was in England in his younger days. So, of course, no one can say for sure, but that's the way the experts are leaning now. So this is shows evidence of John with his first family in Norfolk. So this reads, Hezekiah, the son of John Haynes, gentleman, was baptized 16 days of August, and it's recorded in Norfolk at Hettingham Hall in this year, or between those years. And then he returned to England, and it was recorded that he had returned in 1646 to write his will. And in it, he refers to the two caretakers of Copford or Cop Hall. One was his brother-in-law. And they were appointed to oversee it until his sons came of age to inherit. And so I started out, and I had this road map. I arrived and stayed near Colchester, and this is Copford over here, and Google Maps did not show where the manor house was. And the larger estate in Haynes' time would have been a broad swath of this, including a lot of farmland. And, you know, all I could find was the church. However, someone I talked to said, well, just go, you know, make your way to the church parking lot from the footpath, and you can, we've heard you can see a little bit of the manor house from the church parking lot. So that was my goal. But what I really needed was this map, and it's an interesting 1784 garden plan. So these were all the plantings that this Richard Wood was planning for the estate that was closest to the manor house and the church. And so here's where the parking lot is currently. So I was coming on a footpath off this way, but people who drive in modern times to the church come this way. So it was just going to be kind of a, you know, what will I find? I'll just go on this public footpath and hope for the best. So off I went, and I'm in the land of John Haynes. And of course, whenever we travel to an ancestral site, this country or another, it's always exciting, I think. And so I started at the Swan Inn, and I followed the Roman River. And this is the country of Boudica, and if you know who she was, so I followed the Roman River and for part of the way, and came to some more farm pasture land and crops and so forth, and turned the wrong way at different times. So it was, originally supposed to be 1.5 miles, but I think I walked at least 2. Got a little nutty. But through the whole walk, I just was so, touched by the fact that I was, walking where John Haynes and his sons had been themselves 4 centuries ago, or rode on their horses and so forth. Let's see. I think there was a chat question. Hang on. Yeah, I can't see it. Can someone tell me what that was?
Steve Aberley was saying that ordnance maps show some of the details.
Yeah, I was
Okay,
just giving
yeah.
that to everybody. It wasn't necessarily to you, Fran. It was just had to do with ordnance survey maps versus A to Z maps.
Okay, right. And, it's kind of interesting. Google Maps, I think for privacy reasons, the manor house owner did not want his building identified. And let's see, go back to that, because, why isn't this letting me go back? Oops, I'm going forward. Okay, yeah, so the manor house on Google Maps, they wouldn't identify that, and there are a number of other structures. You can see these are older structures from that time, but now there are other structures, including a cricket house, and then other buildings here and there scattered around. And so I just couldn't figure out from Google, without any label on it, where the manor house, which of those structures it was, or if it was further afield. So anyway, you get the idea. So this is the only path I encountered, and this is kind of typical of what I was walking through. And then incredibly, I came out of this little wooded area at the end, and the manor house was just right there. I had seen a photo of it, so I recognized it right off the bat. Now, the original home was built, and this is just from memory now, so I think it was 1549. This is a facade built in the 1700s, and so that was placed over the existing manor house. The first structures on the property here were what bishops built in, I think it was the 700s or 970. Sorry, this is going to be winging it, like I said. So I took my next photo from here, and then I was floored last week. I unstuck a page in Anson's book and realized he had gone to this site also. He's gone to other sites that you'll see further into the show, but I just found this photo, and once again I was amazed at the similarity of our trips. I do think there's a little bit of architectural addition here, but otherwise the house looks identical from 1892. Next door, I walked to the St. Michael and All Angels Church, built in 1150, and it's a most remarkable structure. You don't see too many of like this in England. It was an estate church. It belonged to the Lord of the Manor, so that meant when the Haynes family bought it, they were responsible for this church. They were responsible for its upkeep. They were responsible for the pastor or vicar. And of course, these were, changing times religiously, but they were still responsible for it. So they would have known this very well. It's 870 years old, and these insets, this is wording that came from the Essex Church's website. So it's built of rubble mixed with Roman and medieval bricks. And I have to say that I did see flint among the stone in it. And you know, this part of England is not does not have a lot of stone available, and so it's also a little bit unusual that way, that it's a stone church. The most striking part of the building is the apse on the eastern side, and it's a rare feature in English churches and reflects, you know, its closeness to the Roman buildings of Colchester and that history. And then this is, you know, what I had just sort of unstuck last week, and shows you the only two photos that Dudley, excuse me, that Anson Stokes took, you know, in 1892. But I was surprised and kind of slightly dismayed, really, that he only took this picture of the church, which has so many, you know, more interesting and historical features to it than this little end here. But I think maybe, like me, you know, when I stood here, he might have been trying to get the perspective of the church to the manor house, even though it was at that time covered up with shrubs. So here's a closer up, and I'm showing you this because I want you to see how interesting it is. The seam down the building shows where this 1700s addition was attached. You can see the old tracery window from the earlier period here, and the profile of the house would have gone up this way and then across here and down. And then this is, you know, that square facade that they stuck on the three sides of the house. And then this close-up of, you know, the church gives you, you know, such an interesting view of the different ages of stone through time. This buttress was added later. You know, it's got the lancet windows, and you know, no doubt stained glass was probably removed during the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, this is the eastern apse again, and a better view of it, and it sits, you know, the little graveyard surrounds it, and then I was standing right there, and then I just turned a quarter and looked, you know, at the back, and of course, where else but in England would you find a graveyard overlooking a tennis court, right? So, now this is my photo. I've had to lighten it so you can see these amazing medieval pictures, but this is their wording. When you walk into the church, be prepared to gasp aloud, and I can vouch for that. Every surface of the nave is covered in medieval wall paintings. It's of 34 distinct biblical stories. And the artist is likely Master Hugo. He worked at Bury St. Edmunds in the 1130s. And you can see that rounded apse in the back. And this is the apse itself, and so sections of the murals were lost over time, as you know, arches like this were inserted a bit later, but the remaining paintings were covered completely in this period, 1547, and you know, I hope that rings a bell. That is the, you know, period of, you know, think of Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries, the Reformation of the church. And so limewash caused the entire interior of this church to be all white. Now, if you think of the timing of that, that means that John Haynes and his sons, they never saw any of this. All they saw was a completely white interior. Then in 1690, sections of the painting were discovered by some workmen. And then in 1871, the limewash was removed in the apse, revealing the figure of Christ in majesty. So this was the area where they first really looked at what was under the limewash. And then the further restoration was done at different times, you know, including in the 1990s. And that was the last big push to restore some of these paintings, and, you know, trying to match painting color and kind of bring it back alive. Now, what we would consider signs, astrology signs, was normal. This was normal to be found in European medieval churches, including very early churches. This was for them the calendar. And really, we essentially use the Roman calendar today. So the Romans had brought this to the British Isles and to, a lot of Europe, and with Christianity at the same time. And so this denoted a passing of time to them. I was, sitting here, and I came back a second time, and it was pouring rain, and I just was in love with this church and so amazed by it. And this woman, this elderly woman, walked in, and it turns out she was one of the restorers from the 1990s, and she hadn't been in here in a long time. And she said to me, "Oh, I've just been so longing to come back here again." And I couldn't believe my luck. I mean, I'd come here twice, no one was in here, and then I get to meet a restorer. Just great serendipity. She was the one who pointed out that this, behind me, I'd ignored it, was the Haynes coat of arms. It's actually a painting of it hanging on the wall. And she said it had been there when she was there, and for who knows how long before that. But I thought, wow, that was pretty cool. I regret that I didn't get a picture of her, and I wish I had, standing next to the area that she restored, which was kind of off to the right and up toward the ceiling. So that ended my last visit to the land of John Haynes, and it was just an amazing walk back home. I was kind of running late, and it was a little bit sunsetish and so forth, but it was just, kind of a hauntingly beautiful experience, and just unforgettable even now. So now I'm going to switch to the family line of Mabel Harlakenden. So she was born in Essex, in that village of Earl's Colne, named for the Earls of Oxford. She came over with her brother Roger. She left behind her portrait because a rejected suitor had thrust his sword through the right eye. Or so the story goes, and actually there is a big cut in it. I'll show you later. She married John at 22, produced 5 children. He died in 54, and then she married the son of the governor of New Haven colony, and sadly, there was another of many epidemics in New Haven, and they both died. She was 41 years old. Her father came from an ancient Saxon line. I'm guessing not too many of you have heard the name Harlakenden. And it was interesting. The person who took me around that area pronounced it Harlakenden, but then I told him where the name came from, which he didn't realize. So I think he's calling it Harlakenden now. So it's essentially Harold of Kent, and Harl was kind of the old Saxon name for Harold. And they were landholders in Kent for centuries. You can see that, the Saxons most were there by 500 AD. Then a few family members shifted north to London, and then her grandfather to Essex during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Her mother was from a Norman line, and these are very obviously French type of names. This name is pretty common in the US. This name is converted to Hubert, but back then it was Hubert, and often spelled with a T. And of course, the William the Conqueror and the Normans arrived 1066 onward. The Leaventhorpe line, it's interesting, is extinct now, but we're going to start with them. So there were a lot of sources for this, but this book had the easiest chart to follow. So here's Mabel and the Hubert family, and the Chauncey. They were knights, Norman knights, and then this son was the brother of the son. So anyway, they both go back to John and Alice, and then this John is the son of Anne Leaventhorpe and John Chauncey. So I have this one starred because this was a family name that I was a little bit familiar with from a biography of one of England's kings, and that caught my eye. And then upon further research, I was even more interested to know about the relationship. And so this from the Hertfordshire Archaeological Society shows the relationship. She's Anne, married to John Chauncey, and daughter of John Leventhorpe of Shingle Hall, Sobridgeworth. And he's buried here, and his memorial, brass memorial, looks like this. And he had such an interesting history. He was one of the most powerful and influential figures of his day. And he served under two kings. He was their attorney general, Henry IV, Henry V. He was their executor, and he was a member of parliament. His 5-page biography you can find it on History of Parliament online. So I was really taken with that. It's obviously a very old brass memorial, suffered a bit. But I thought, oh my goodness, this is an ancestor, and I want to see him. So off we go. But let me just, it's hard to keep track of what kings are who. So just as background, Henry IV was the fellow in the play Richard II who usurps that throne with a lot of support from the King's Court and many others, including John of Gaunt. He was actually the son of John of Gaunt. In this painting of the time, it was done the year he was crowned, you see him in two ways. He's with his spiritual lords on the left, so the church leaders, his priests, and you see him with his lords secular, members of his court, his council, of which John Leventhorpe would have been one, and I wish I knew which one he was, assuming he's in this at all. And then Henry IV's son, of course, is Henry V, famous for the Shakespeare play of that name, and the Battle of Agincourt, and Band of Brothers, Legacy, so forth, and so on. So here's an illustration of his and his wife Catherine's memorials. And so that's what I'll be looking for as I go inside the church. Now, what happened is I had made contact, and if you've traveled in England and attempted to visit some of these sites, you have to find out who the key holder is, make contact, or find out when the churches are going to be open. And so then you can get in on your own, or they'll meet you. So I had contacted, this ahead, and they opened the church for me ahead. I went in, but I'll be darned, I could not find the memorials. So Mr. Jones came over, the key keeper, to help, and showed me where they were. And then his wife called and said, you have to bring her over for tea. And it was a fantastic experience. They had me over to their lovely home, and she told me about her Saxon ancestors that had been in this village from that time. So that's a long history she had there. So let's go inside the church. And this is Catherine, and she's, he's just lifted up the rug so I can see them. And sorry, I've tried to, help with improving the photo as much as possible, but the lighting was either very dark, or shafts of sun would come in and brighten just sections. And then, these are brass memorials, so that, of course, they reflect a lot. And then this is a better view. They're nearly full-sized, and they're just remarkable. They're they're many centuries old. His sword was so real seeming. I mean, it looked like you just pull it out and use it. His dog, has a collar that is so much like the collars of today, with a little ring for the leash. Here are his medieval armored feet. Here's Catherine's dog, and she has the pup has a collar with bells on it. and then Catherine's head and coat of arms, which I think actually is probably the Chauncey coat of arms. Now, speaking of Chauncey coat of arms, these are the grandchildren of John Leaventhorpe and Catherine Riley. Unfortunately, Anne Leaventhorpe and her husband John their memorials were lost. But Anne gave birth to 18 children, and needless to say, she died in her early 40s, and quite a bit earlier than her husband. This John is the one who was heir, the eldest, and is another direct ancestor. So this church was home to both the Chaunceys and Leaventhorpes, and so there were many memorials in here. The most prominent of all was the last heir, the modern John Leaventhorpe of Elizabethan times. And you can't miss his memorial when you go in. Here it is. This is, a sort of classic Elizabethan Jacobean sculpture memorial. It's faded incredibly. Memorials of this time would be very brightly painted. The skin would be painted very white, the hair, brownish red. Almost all of them were that way. The clothing, some of the clothing would be very bright. Still, it's remarkable how the condition is now, despite how much it's faded. Okay, so next up, I was going to attempt to visit the Earls of Oxford tombs and its relationship to Mabel's paternal line. There's a connection between the two. And so I had to find out where those tombs were. And of course, my first assumption was that it would be at the Earls of Oxford Castle Hettingham, their primary home, right? Well, turned out not to be the case, but I'll show you right now the Dudley's connection to them. So here's Thomas Dudley, and I've got his direct Oxford ancestors highlighted. So all the ones in yellow, Margaret and John and Joan and Robert and so forth in yellow. But the ones circled are the ones that I was able to visit. So Margaret's brother, and then the direct ancestors that are circled. And how does this look? So you've seen the family genealogy from my grandmother to Thomas Dudley. So here's the two perspectives from his mother to Margaret de Vere, her brother Thomas the 8th Earl, and their father John the 7th Earl, and then he goes up to the 6th, 5th, 4th, etc., other earls. And then from his father's line, and this is a little less proven. There's some historians that totally believe this is proven. Anyway, that's another story, but that line shows up to Joan de Vere and her father Robert and so forth. So let's go look at them, how to do that. So this was tricky, and I just was so confused because where I found information about where they were was through a site, in a different county of Suffolk, and a place called St. Stephen's Chapel Barn. So I contacted the website master, the webmaster, a man named Alan Beals, and I asked him, could I get a key to be let in? And so we had this back and forth of emails and through time up to when I came, but he said, I'll make sure the key is available for you. I had to give him, like family chart and some personal information because, I was going to be on a private farm, and they're understandably careful about that. So it was an interesting process, but we had a good communication. And when I said I was planning to get off the train and walk a mile to St. Stephen's, he was aghast, as he knew how old I was, and thought that was crazy. So he said he would come pick me up, and he wound up being my tour guide that day. And I was just so fortunate. First, actually, we went to his house and had tea with his wife and tried to talk her into joining us. And she said, "I've heard this so many times before. I'll pass." You can imagine. So here we are, Castle Hettingham, the home of the Earls of Oxford. It's built by Aubrey, 1140. It's very austere because so much of it has been chipped away on the outside. So, it's not, if you're going to pick a beautiful castle to visit, this isn't going to be one of them, but it's certainly important historically. You can go in, you only see the Great Hall, and it's just essentially bare except for this and a table with some old helmets. So, I was just kind of surprised. I was thinking there'd be a little more to it. This bridge is quite beautiful. It's the Queen Elizabeth Bridge. There is a church, but surprisingly, that doesn't house the tombs. And another interesting thing that amazed me is that there's a De Vere descendant that whose family still lives here in apartments upstairs. Must be kind of an interesting place in there. So the second property of the Earls of Oxford that's very essential is called Earl's Colne. You can see on this map it's not too far away. It was something they created. They built and funded a Benedictine priory. They made sure and added a private chapel for their tombs. And of course, they built a manor house, so it was their private retreat. And then the 1500s came, the dissolution of the monasteries. Priory was closed, and then over time it was neglected. And as so often happens, the stones, windows, so forth and so on were recycled, used to build other buildings. Then in 1592, the estate was sold to Mabel's grandfather and put in the name of her father. From that date onward, the manor was still inhabited into the 1700s, during which time a second manor house was built. And actually, two manors existed at one point in time where people were living in both. The first manor was used for the second manor's additions, walls, and gates. And Mabel's grandfather was the first commoner to own the property. But, so what happened to the tombs? Because they were in that chapel, right? And so if the priory was, falling apart, what happened? So first what happened was that Mabel's brother, who was the heir after his grandfather and father died, he attempted to send them to the British Museum. So he pulled them out of kind of the ruins of the priory and set them out to be picked up, but he died before this happened. And then, for reasons I don't know, the British Museum backed out of the plan, and the tombs were sat out, exposed to the elements for 200 years, which I find, kind of mind-boggling. I'm still amazed and surprised that they weren't, sent back to Hettingham Castle. You would think that would be the logical place. In any case, guess where they wound up? So what happened was at the turn of the last century, around 1900, the person who inherited Earl's Colne in kind of his midlife was a man I'll call Captain Geoffrey. So Captain Geoffrey was a descendant of the Harlakendens, and he inherited Earl's Colne, which was, not in good shape. These tombs were out by then. They'd, been strewn apart. Bad things had happened to them, weather, bad human behavior, etc. And so they were what Geoffrey, the elder Geoffrey, did was he hired an archaeologist. He had the archaeologist find, collect, sort, and put back together as many tombs as he could, and there weren't many that he could do that with. And then he had those that were redeemable put here. And through the history of this chapel, it was abandoned at the Reformation. It was, built as a small chapel in the 13th century. Then it was abandoned in the Reformation and converted into a smallpox hospital, a school, a farm worker's cottage, and then a barn. And this was taken when it was a barn. You can see the hay lying around. And that's where it got its chapel barn name. Then it was closed up, buttresses added, became a chapel once more, thanks to Captain Jeffrey. So here is Alan standing in front of how it looks now. And then there's interesting history here. If you've seen the Last Kingdom series, you might have seen this kind of awful scene where poor Edmund, the martyr, is killed by arrows. He was at one time a Saxon king of East Anglia, killed by the Viking Danes. And there are other reasons why East Anglian history, why this is an interesting site. Okay, let's go in. So here is, you walk in, and here's how it looks with these tombs. Tiny little chapel filled with tombs. This is Thomas, brother of Margaret. These are later Earl and wife that I'm not going to talk about. I'm not in their line. Aubrey, the progenitor, is down here on the floor. Robert the 5th Earl is here. Now there's a tiny little balcony up there that this picture was taken of, not my photo, but the other two are my photos. Here's Alan at the foot of Robert. He's standing about right here. And then let's go to Aubrey. Here's Aubrey. And it was too dark when I was trying to take a photo. These are better photos I used from Alan's site. This was the coffin lid for Aubrey, born before 1080. He was Great Chamberlain under Henry I, when it built Castle Hettingham, etc. So you can see his legs are still visible. His deme is visible. And then the rest of his, effigy is elsewhere, so probably crumbled in the grounds of Earl's Colne. Then his actual stone coffin that was underneath contained his body, and the skeleton, the skeletal remains are, of course, are long gone. So this is supposedly a 26th great grandfather, and it was pretty incredible to look at this thing on the floor, and it was just remarkable thinking of how old he was and how far back in time, and just another wow moment. Then walked over to Robert, the 5th Earl. He took part in the Second Barons' Revolt, died in 1296, and his effigy was made around 1300. It's not sitting on its original tomb chest, but they couldn't find another appropriate tomb chest, so they used this one, of whom they know not who it belongs. And let's look at details of him. His arm was reattached and plastered. His helmet was put back on and the face replastered. All the chainmail has worn away. His leg was reattached, and it's lying on what is the badge of the Earls of Oxford, the blue boar. So now to Thomas. And so here's how Thomas's face originally looked, and here's how it looks today. So much of it worn away, a lot of the helmet, most of the chainmail, but the star symbol can still see. His mustache is pretty much worn away. And he served in, you may have heard of the 100 Years' War of Edward III, so he was in some of those campaigns. And as I said before, he was a brother of Margaret de Vere. Now I want to say that what's important and why I'm showing his tomb is because his tomb chest has been cut. It was originally double or triple the width that you see here. They believe that it was cut for strange purposes, but that it originally held he and his wife, and possibly even his son, who died at age 36. So keep him in mind, because I'm going to talk about him in a minute. So then I really wanted to see one more Earl of Oxford tomb, and that was in Hatfield Broad Oak, a village in western Essex, and this is the church where I traveled to. So it's called St. Virgin the Mary at Hatfield Broad Oak, and look how worn away his effigy is. He was, a Magna Carta baron, so his tomb is 750 years old, and his face is completely worn away. You can see the star on his shield. Quite a bit of the chainmail, amazingly, is still visible. The tomb chest is gone. He's sitting on just a stone in the middle of the church. And his background, he went against his family connections to join the other barons against King John to make him sign the what we now know as the Magna Carta in 1215. And his lands were taken away, including Castle Hettingham, and they were only issued back to his descendants after King John died. So yeah, he sacrificed quite a bit. And I was, I was not only amazed to be, with present here alone, but that is so few know of him. It's just, amazing to me that he's unknown, kind of unknown, and no tourist ever goes here. And it's a pretty powerful thing to be looking at a Magna Carta baron's effigy. The reason his effigy was worn down, it's a very similar story to the Earl's Colne story. This church was built atop a crumbling priory that was crumbling and stones being recycled after the dissolution of the monastery. So it was called Hatfield St. Regis Priory. And unfortunately, the church wasn't built, fast enough to move him in to preserve him. So he was sitting out for, probably several hundred years. So farewell to the Magna Carta baron. And back to Earl's Colne. So now we're into transition to the second manor house. So as I said, the two manor houses existed at one point simultaneously, but eventually the first manor house was, completely recycled, and things were added on this property. It's now owned by a race car magnate, so I was not invited to see it. Boo-hoo. But guess who was? Anson. So he met Geoffrey the Elder, the captain here, and this is his photo. And so my photo is from just over the wall here. I'm standing and I can see the top of the manor here. And now I want you to look at that gate, and then there's another one that I'm standing closer to that looks very similar, because guess what happened to that partial tomb chest, the part that got cut off? Yes, it was placed on the gates. So this stuff was stripped off, and these sections, these insets that typically show family members of the deceased, that was stuck up here, and that was put on those two gates at least. And how do I know this? It's actually because the St. Andrew's Church across the street, their guidebook told me that. So I walked over and I just was floored. So it kind of have mixed feelings about this, but it's, what can I say? Yeah, that new ideas in recycling. So how about this St. Andrew's Church? This was a parish church, and it was another thing that was built thanks to the Earls of Oxford. Mabel was baptized there, and here is that church. Her brothers were also baptized there. Her grandparents and parents and brothers were buried here. Everybody's got various memorials here. It is such a beautiful church. And incredibly, when I walked in, and you can see these instruments here, there were musicians playing Elizabethan music, but there were no other visitors. Now here I am. I've come to visit my Elizabethan era ancestors, and I have this accompaniment. It was just, I thought, did my family call ahead and arrange this as a prank? It was so wonderful. It turned out, of course, they were just rehearsing for a concert and had nothing to do with me and my ancestors. But how lucky! It was a great way to walk around and look at all that I wanted to look at. Speaking of which, one of the most interesting things, you will not find a lot of church towers that have this. The power and influence of the Earls of Oxford is even on the church tower. Yes, that's their coat of arms. The star symbol is theirs. It probably represents each one of the earls through time. Here's the suspended crown, which shows their connection to the crown. The S stands for their connection to the Lancastrian line of the Wars of the Roses. If you know that, it was Lancaster versus York, and so they were supporting the Lancasters. And so back inside, I immediately spotted Roger Harlequinden's memorial, and at this point, volunteers came in and they let me climb up on a chair to photograph them. So I was able to photograph the inscription and the memorial itself. So let's take a look. So here's Roger, his wife Elizabeth, who bore all of his children. And then he married 3 widows after that, and they all came with their own estates and offspring. Now, here is his interesting memorial inscription. So what do you think he meant by this? Here lies Roger Harlequinden of Earl's Colne in the county of Essex, Esquire, descended of the ancient family of Harlequinden in Woodchurch in the county of Kent, the chief house whereof was anciently called the borough of Harlakenden, also the den, which means the land of Harlequinden, and is now commonly called Old Harlequinden. So that's a lot of Harlequinden in this inscription. So what he meant by this was, I'm more English than you are, dudes. So, here there he is. He's moved into this estate. He's surrounded by all this power of the earls, who are come from a Norman line. And so the church guide tells us it was a subtle hint of one-upmanship, showing the 400-year difference between his ancestor, a Saxon nobleman, versus the much later Norman immigrants. So, good for him. But you have to wonder, how did he wind up with their estate, this estate that for centuries had belonged only to them? Well, yes, he was a robber baron, and yes, it was revenge of the Saxons. So what happened was he was a London clerk who became a land agent for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and the last Earl to own this land. The Earl was bankrupt by 1592, and everybody saw this coming who knew anything about the Earl and who had any legal connections in London, as the news was out. So Roger convinced the Earl to let him buy Colne Priory Estate for a pittance, way below its real value. Regretting the sale later, the Earl took Roger to court, not just once, many lawsuits. There's even a PhD dissertation someone did on this, Daphne Pearson, Robin Hood's Pennyworthy, the de Vere Harlequinden lawsuits, in which she tells us that Harlequinden was the Robin Hood of his day. But wait, guess who else was involved? Remember Edward Hubert on her mother's side? Well, that grandfather was a super savvy opportunist. He was a clerk of Chancery Court, very lucrative position. The Queen put him in the position of being trustee and receivers for some of the Earl's property. He even helped his sister Joan become the Earl's 3rd wife. And then after acquiring one of the Earl's properties. The Earl had friends or relatives or somebody living on it who weren't paying rent. So Edward Hubert sued the Earl and won £5,000. That's a lot of pounds back in that day. At which point the Earl went into a steep dive. And so Edward Hubert helped push the sale of Colne Priory to Roger Harlakenden, in that year of 1592. Now, just other little tidbits. This was where he's buried at his former estate, and which became Findlay College of Psychic Sciences, which somehow that seems like karma to me. Anyway, poor Earl, 17th Earl, he just couldn't get away from this family, and yet he probably brought them together, because in the same year, yes, two robber barons joined their families in marriage, and who knew that Westminster Hall could be matchmaking central? So, meanwhile, the Queen was overwhelmed for years by De Vere's court cases, at one point banishing to Europe. Bad boy Edward, the 17th Earl, was a man of lost fortunes, but great intellect. He was a poet. He was fluent in many languages, traveled the world kind of guy. He was put into an arranged marriage with the ward he'd has it as a teenager, who happened to be the Queen's advisor, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. And Lord Burleigh and his son Robert, they had a lot of conflict with the Earl over time. And they, by 1592, started advising and supporting Roger in the lawsuits against their own in-law. What a soap opera. So until the day they both died, they were still in this court case over the sale of Colne Priory. But it stayed in the hands of the Harlequinden family. Now, just amazingly, it turns out, did you know the 17th Earl is believed by some to be the real Shakespeare? I don't know if you've heard about the Shakespeare debate, but there is one. You can join in and go to doubtaboutwill.org. Yes, many famous people have joined, and writers through time, Mark Twain, Henry James, a zillion current British actors have all gotten on board with this, and two kind of well-known ones. Derek Jacobi is a strong proponent. He, Vanessa Redgrave, and others have strongly believed that Edward de Vere fits all the bells and whistles of what would be needed to write the Shakespeare plays. Now, Mark Rylance leans a little bit more toward Christopher Marlowe. But anyway, you can look online, and you can also see this movie with Rhys Ifans, the Welsh actor, playing the 17th Earl, and Vanessa Redgrave as Queen Elizabeth I. And, it's just a crushing blow that Mabel, her family, and Earl's Colne were left out of the plot. It was so sad. Okay, back to the genealogy. So when I arrived at the train station and Alan Beals picked me up, I asked, so where are we going first? And he said, you're going to meet your cousin Geoffrey at his house. And I was like, wow, how nice of him. And, I pictured, I knew that this was a farm where that barn chapel was. So I pictured a charming middle-class farm home. But instead, it was this. A manor house built circa 1490. It's just an incredible place. And here's Geoffrey. He's my 12th cousin. He descends from Richard, the brother of Mabel Harlakenden. And Richard was the heir of Earl's Colne, who stayed behind. He was the one that tried to turn those tombs over to the British Museum. And so he stayed behind while his siblings went off to America. Here's Geoffrey. I took this photo of him standing under the portrait of Richard. And then this is the same portrait taken by Anson Phelps 125 years earlier when he met with the elder Geoffrey. Now, you're just going to be amazed, but neither this Geoffrey nor I knew that our forebears had met with each other 125 years earlier. It's just amazing what you find out. So Geoffrey made us tea. This is in the older section of the house. There have been more recent additions. It's a complex house. And then there he showed me the original Jocelyn diary, which was the size of my little short hand. And the writing was so tiny, we both admired how anyone could write that small, much less read it. Jocelyn is famous among British historians for his candor and details of daily 17th century family life and village life. So what's the connection here? Jocelyn was a contemporary of Richard in the village. So Richard was Lord of the Manor, and he was the pastor of St. Andrews. And the two families later married each other. And so that's how the diary was passed down through the Harlequinden line to Geoffrey. So we went upstairs and saw the portrait of another Mabel, and I believe this is the Aunt Mabel of Geoffrey's Richard and my Mabel. So she was born in Queen Elizabeth's time, and it was just incredible that he pulled this out of a closet, and I got to hold it, and to be so close to an original painting from that time. Of course, none of this was I expecting. So this whole visit was, the entire time I had trouble not saying, holy cow. In the same room was Roger's original bed, including the headboard where he'd carved his name. And that was an incredible thing. I did not know, how common that was, that sometimes lords of the manor had beds that they deemed valuable, that were inherited over time, and that they would carve their name into it with a date and so forth. And Roger died in that bed in 1604. So it was just a remarkable thing to see. Really, everything on this property and in this house was a jaw-dropping experience for me to see, including the windows, which turned out many of them had been moved from the first Prairie Manor house, which was very old, into this house. So that included this, and then he showed me, from the inside, some of the windows upstairs were also, from that period. And you can see the complexity of this house. It's the whole thing. You could write a book just on this house, and all the details of how it was built. The inside has, armor. It has these plank floors that, of course, are not even. It's a pretty cool place to see. Other things we talked about, both our fathers had been in Germany in World War II. He had also seen the movie Anonymous and wasn't too happy about it. The portrait of Mabel Harlequin Haynes, I had read that it was in New England, and I thought it was at the Capitol building in Hartford. And he thought it must be somebody else. It's hard to believe my great-grandfather would let that go. And neither of us knew then that indeed Cousin Anson had purchased it from Geoffrey's great-grandfather 125 years earlier. And the story of Mabel's portrait goes like this. So here it is, as it was in the 1890s. And Geoffrey the Elder took this photo, thankfully, before he sent it to London for cleaning. Now, her right eye has a slash mark, and that is supposedly where the rejected suitor put his sword through it. So what happened was the cleaning and the restorers pretty much painted a new set of features onto her. And she's so altered, it's kind of awful and kind of darkened also. So Geoffrey the elder at that point was sold it, was willing to sell it to Anson, and gave him the buyer beware update and also the photo of how the original portrait looked. So years later, Anson took it to restorers in Boston or somewhere in Connecticut when techniques had improved a lot. And her facial features obviously are much closer to the original. Now this is my photo, and I'm at kind of an angle to avoid the glare, so you're not getting quite the head on, but it really does match the face so much better, along with some of the other details. I was so lucky to see this. I thought it was in Hartford. I had gone to Boston 2019 and gone to the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and if you've never been, it's a very cool place to visit. And when I was there looking at something else, they said, you should go up to the 3rd floor because we have furniture of, I think it was like the chair of John Hancock or something. You should go and look at it. So we went up the elevator to the 3rd floor, and I was looking at the chair, and I turned around, and there was Mabel Harlequinden. I was so excited to see her and to see the painting up close. And this is the oldest painting they have at the Genealogical Society there. So if you're ever there, take a look. And they had just actually taken it out and put a new inscription up and the whole bit. So perfect timing. So happy ending for her portrait, and thank you so much for listening, and thank you for having me at your meeting. And how do I get out of share? Okay, I must be away.
Thank you very much, Fran. That was great.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
You have an amazing genealogy. That was really fun to listen to.
Yes.
You probably have something very similar. It's just a matter of discovering it.